Habits are routines that become smooth and effortless with repetition. By developing the right habits for learning Chinese, you can learn more with less effort. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are talking about habits and how you can build good habits for learning Chinese and other languages. Habits are essential for managing daily life efficiently, and if you can build proper language learning habits, everything will become much easier and less effortful. If you think about it, if you have to make deliberate decisions about every action you take in a normal day, it would quickly lead to mental exhaustion. This is not how we lead our lives typically, though. We have lots of routines and habits that we perform every day, usually without thinking about it. And even if we do think about it, it requires very little energy to make decisions and decide what to do. We're just on autopilot. Brushing your teeth might be a good example of a habit. It's not that we don't think about brushing our teeth, and when we brush our teeth, we do of course notice, but we don't spend time thinking about when to do it, or we don't schedule it, or we don't need to spend effort and energy trying to get this thing done. Whereas that might be the case with many language learning activities that you think you ought to do. My favorite way of talking about habits comes from a Kurzgesagt video that I will link in the description, and it takes place in a jungle. So imagine yourself in a jungle. You have a small camp, and now you need to go to the river to get water. The first time you do this, it will be very difficult. You have to hack your way through the undergrowth with a machete, and this is hard work. You're going to sweat a lot, and you're going to expend a lot of energy just getting to the river. You do eventually get there, however. You fill your buckets with water and you get back to your camp. But you probably lost more water through sweat than your buckets contain, so it's questionable if this is worthwhile doing, at least if you're only doing it once. Fortunately, next time you need to get water from the river, it is much easier to do so because you've already hacked your way through the jungle once. When you've been doing this for a week, a little path starts emerging and walking to the river will no longer be as difficult as it once was. As you're doing this day by day, you'll be able to pave the path to form a road too. Something that used to take a lot of energy has become easier and less effortful. I like this analogy because it captures some of the key aspects of habit formation, and the first one is of course that it is effortful. In order to establish and maintain habits, you need to spend a lot of energy up front, and the idea is to make this activity easier further down the road, but that doesn't mean it's easy before the habit is in place. For example, let's say that you heed my advice and try to listen to Chinese podcasts when you're out running or walking, and the first time you switch out your English podcasts or audiobooks to something in Chinese, you will feel some resistance. It might not be as hard as blazing your way through a jungle, but consistently listening to Chinese every day will be challenging at first and requires some courage and motivation to get started. Forming a habit also takes time, so you need to maintain your concentration and attention to this new habit so you don't forget it, and this can sometimes take a month or even longer. I also like this analogy because it gives a clear picture of what you are doing. It is difficult to do new things. It does require effort compared to doing what you used to do before, but the more you do something, the easier it gets. There will come a day when you think it's strange to not listen to Chinese podcasts when you're out, because you've been doing it for so long and it has become a habit. I'm using listening as an example here, but there are of course many useful habits for other areas of learning Chinese as well, such as reading Chinese before going to bed, reviewing vocabulary in the morning, or maybe counting steps in Mandarin as you go up and down stairs. If you want to read up on habit formation, I strongly recommend Atomic Habits by James Clear, which goes through all the basic research about habit formation and also packages it in a practically applicable way. One thing he said in that book that stuck with me more than most things was that habits are like compound interest. If you keep making small improvements and build small habits, the benefits will add up over time, and this is much like steady savings in your bank account. This stresses the importance of having a long-term perspective. It doesn't really matter if you double your learning time this week and then go back to your normal next week. This is just a blip and it has nothing to do with your time investments over time. But if you make small and lasting improvements, these will add up, and if you can keep them, that also means that they will have a large impact over time. If you build a habit that allows you to listen 10 more minutes every day, and you do that for 5 years, this is quite significant. And of course, you're not going to build just one habit. You don't need to revolutionize and turn your life upside down and do everything right starting tomorrow. Instead, you make small incremental improvements, and by making sure these stick and are long term, you will then change how you learn Chinese over time and make it more enjoyable and less effortful. The more I learn Chinese and other languages, the more I realize that studying a little bit every day is much more important than binge studying once a week. This is not just for the reason I just mentioned, it's also because diversifying your learning and spreading it out over the day is much more efficient. You can make use of small pockets of time, and also spreading things out over time makes it much easier to remember things. And for example, then, if we take vocabulary learning, spreading it out and doing a little bit in pockets of, say, 3 minutes spread out over a day is better for retention than reviewing everything you've learned in 1 week at the very end. This type of diversified listening is something we talked about in episode 7 of the podcast, and I'll also put links in the show notes as usual. Habits can, of course, both be good and bad, but from a language learning perspective, this is not too tricky to sort out. Good habits are simply activities that help you achieve your goals, and bad habits are those that do not. The goal then is not only to form good habits, but also to transform bad habits into good ones or eliminate them entirely. Naturally, there are many habits that people will consider good, but aren't good from a language learning perspective. For example, it's advisable to brush your teeth, eat healthily, and so on, but since the link to language learning is very indirect at best, this is not something I want to talk about here. Instead, you can think of bad habits for language learning as habits that could be transformed into good ones. So, for example, if you have the habit of listening to podcasts in your native language when you go out and run or walk, you can then see that as a habit that can be transformed into doing the same thing but in your target language. Naturally, having a habit of going out for a walk or run is good in itself, but we're after the language learning aspects here. In Atomic Habits, James Clear describes a habit cycle with 4 steps, so let's have a look at that and see how that can help us form habits for learning Chinese. The 4 steps are cue, craving, response, and reward. So the cue is what initiates the habit cycle and prompts you to think about your habit. Here you want this to be as clear and specific as possible, and this helps to establish the habit efficiently. For example, decide to start a podcast every morning as soon as you leave home. You can also try attaching your new habit to a well-established one, such as brushing your teeth. For example, if you want to use Scritter to review vocabulary more, well, then try to form the habit of doing this 5 minutes right after you brush your teeth, for example. The earlier example I mentioned of listening to a podcast when you go out for a walk is also a good example. Naturally, forming a new habit here is not only about effort. You have to actually think about the habit, and there is a risk that you forget it, and this is where the cue comes in. You need to make this clear, and you need to make it likely that you actually think of the habit when you are in a situation where it would apply. The second step is craving, and this is about making the activity itself, the action you want to perform, as appealing as possible by focusing on positive aspects. For example, you can associate the activity with the positive outcome you will get further down the road, such as the usefulness, enjoyment, or cool factor of understanding a foreign language. Emphasize how good it will feel to improve your Chinese and improve. And naturally, many activities are in themselves quite rewarding, and then you don't need to try as much, and this means that you should try to find these activities, for example by choosing enjoyable content or learning alongside others. The third step, response, is the action you want to perform. It's what you do to get to the last step, the reward. The key here, in my opinion, is to make the response as effortless as possible. As mentioned when we talked about the jungle analogy and hacking your way through the undergrowth to the river to get water, doing something new is very effortful, and doing it repeatedly and consistently is even harder. This means that it's important that you in advance try to make this activity as easy as possible. It's never going to be easy, but you can at least make it easier. If we stick with the listening example I've used so far, it's important that you make sure you have something to listen to, you know what to listen to, it's on the right level, maybe you've downloaded if you're not sure you will have internet coverage, and so on. In fact, I think these small practical issues are so important that we spent an entire episode about this, namely episode 57, so go check that out. But the more I listen, and I listen a lot, the more I realize that small snags can trip you up entirely. For example, sometimes I listen much less to audiobooks than I normally do, and it's usually because I haven't picked something to listen to. It's not that I don't have anything interesting to listen to, but getting started involves choosing a book. And it's not just about pressing a play button, which is what it should be. It should be really easy and effortless. So check out episode 57 about 7 ideas for smooth and effortless Chinese listening practice. But this is applicable to anything. This goes for vocabulary practice, reading, or anything else you might want to do. The final step in the habit cycle is reward. So after completing your activity, make sure it feels rewarding. This does not mean you have to give yourself a gold star or eat chocolate every time you do what you're supposed to do, because intrinsic motivation typically works much better. Feelings of competence, learning Chinese and feeling that you're improving, that you can listen to these things and understand them and so on, autonomy, being in control of your own learning, and relatedness, connecting with others through this activity, are typically very powerful ways of motivating yourself. We talked about this in much more detail in episode 188, so check that out. As usual, I've put links in the show notes. While intrinsic motivation can be stronger and typically lasts much longer than extrinsic motivation, this doesn't mean that external rewards never work, but it does mean you should be careful with them. In my opinion, the most important thing when forming habits is to take baby steps. This means that being consistent and doing something is always better than doing nothing, and that how long you perform a habit is not the point at the beginning. So, for example, it's much better to always read a little bit before going to bed than reading for the exact amount of time that you intended to read. So, for example, having the habit of reading 1 minute before bed is actually quite good, because increasing that to, say, 10 or 15 minutes is rather easy, and nothing stops you from reading more than 1 minute. However, compare this with having the goal of reading Chinese for 15 minutes before going to bed from scratch with no prior experience of doing this. This might work a few times. I mean, you can hack your way through the jungle if you really want to, but there will be days when you just say, I don't want to do this, 15 minutes is too long, and then you don't do it. But if you start out much more slowly, you can get used to doing this every day, and then after you've established the habit, when you have the consistency, then you add duration or intensity or whatever it is you want to add. By doing this, you also build momentum and self-confidence, because you know that you can do this for, say, 1 minute, and then when you've done that for a while, yeah, I can do this, I can increase it, you do a little bit more. But you start by succeeding, by setting goals you know you will achieve. This is a good example of when you should not aim for the stars. Let's talk a little bit about how long it takes to form a new habit. And there are a bunch of numbers thrown around that you might have seen. Maybe you've seen the 21-day rule, or it's the 30-day rule, or something like that. And the truth is that if you look into the research of habit formation, there is no number. It depends on the individual, it depends on what habit it is, and so on. So there is no one number here. Clearly, though, it takes time, so 5 days is rarely enough, and I would say indeed that 21 or 30 days is not enough either. Here, though, I think the jungle analogy breaks down a little bit. It would seem to imply that the more you do something, the easier it gets. So each time you go to the river to get water, it becomes easier, and this is maybe not a linear process, but it is at least in one direction. It always gets easier. I suppose we could modify the analogy and say that there's been a storm and now trees have fallen across the path, and so going to get the water is not as easy as it was yesterday. But I think there is a more fundamental problem here, because it's not only about effort, it's also about attention. Let's say that you want to form the habit of running 3 times a week. For most people, this is not very hard to do for 1 week, because you started a new project, you have the motivation and the energy to put into it, and your attention is focused on this new project. But this wears off, maybe after a week, maybe after 2 weeks, maybe 3. But there will come a time when you're focusing on something else, and then the weather is not as good today, and you feel tired or something, and you say, Svanla, I'm just not going to do it today. Or something else happens, so your focus is disturbed for some reason, something else happens in your life, and you simply forget about your new habit. This is how I think most habits die, so it's more complex than the jungle analogy seems to imply. I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I think the key to success here is to plan for things going wrong in advance. For example, by predicting what might cause issues for your newly established habit, you can then have a plan to avoid that. For example, traveling is probably the most disrupting thing you can do. So if you have a new habit, you travel for a week, and since you're not at home, you are not in your normal environment, it's very, very easy to forget habits. This is even true for extremely well-established habits such as brushing your teeth. If you think about when you've forgotten to brush your teeth, it's probably when you've done lots of other things you normally don't do. Something else happened, you arrived somewhere very late, or something completely unexpected happened that disturbed your habits and routines. While you can't predict the unpredictable, you can think about an upcoming trip in advance and think, okay, what do I want to do with my habits here? Do I have a plan? Should I pause them? Should I try to do them anyway? And if I want to do them, how can I remind myself of doing them? Maybe I should put reminders in my calendar or some other way of making sure that I don't forget about them. Similarly, if some of your learning habits were disturbed when you were away for a week, you need to consciously put effort into re-establishing them when you get back, and maybe putting a reminder about this in your calendar after you get back home might be a good idea. There are also hundreds of apps that help you establish and maintain habits, and most of them are pretty basic, free to use, and not that complicated, and I do find these somewhat useful. Another trick I find particularly useful is to make myself accountable to other people. So instead of just reminding myself that I'm supposed to do something, I ask other people to check in and see if I've done it. This could be a friend or a family member, or even people you don't know on social media. For example, on some of the Hacking Chinese challenges, I publicly announce my goal and say what I will try to achieve, and this then makes it considerably more likely that I actually do it. It's time to conclude this episode by saying that establishing effective habits can make language learning significantly easier. Consistently doing even small things, such as listening to Chinese a few minutes or reviewing a few Chinese characters when you have the opportunity, you can build routines that then become habits that save a lot of energy and allow you to invest that somewhere else. Habits yield significant benefits over time, even if each specific action is not that significant, so it is indeed very similar to compound interest. Focusing on incrementally building good habits is also better than binge studying, because in the long run, your binges will not be big enough, and it is the small actions you do every day that actually matter. Forging good habits while eliminating or transforming bad ones will help you reach your goals with less effort. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.